victory in Europe, and rejoicing all over the world is the greater because of the recollection of the triumphs of Nazi barbarism and its final overthrow. The world evil began as a doctrine of hate shouted by a demagogue. Hitler shrieked. The mob criminality of Nazism grew and the poison spread over Germany. Hitler taking power. His purpose was war. A powerful military machine was built and plans for ruthless conquest were made by the sneering aggressor. World peace was shaken when the Nazis pushed into Austria. An international crisis as Czechoslovakia was seized. Then war with Poland overwhelmed by the Nazi blitzkrieg. Denmark, Norway. The Low Countries crushed. Holland, Belgium invaded. The beginning of the long horror they were to endure. Scenes that said the ravaging savagery that created this must be destroyed. Dunkirk, where the British Army was evacuated as by a miracle. The nations wondered, could the Nazi ever be overthrown? The blitzkrieg overwhelming France. Hitler thought the war was won. In London, Churchill, now Prime Minister, could only offer blood, sweat, and tears. And London burned in the Great Blitz. The Royal Air Force fought off Hitler's Luftwaffe. The Nazi could not invade Britain and resorted to merciless bombing, seeking to terrorize with horror. Balkans conquered by the armed forces of evil, which swept into North Africa, where fascist Italians had been defeated. Nazi power in Finland, and then Russia invaded. And Nazi power reached its greatest extent. But the Germans at Stalingrad met with decisive disaster. The Nazi tide of evil was turning. Hitler war power had seemed invincible, but now it was shown that the Nazi could be beaten, as illustrated by the destruction of a whole German army at Stalingrad. America, personified by President Roosevelt, entered the war. Seen here at his Atlantic Charter Conference with Churchill, the president stood against the Nazi fury. And after Pearl Harbour, America struck with decisive effect. Across broad seas, great convoys streamed, and troopships were crowded with Americans for the invasion of North Africa. There, the Western Allies won their first victories, sweeping out the Germans in violent battles of the desert. These scenes foreshadowed the stupendous war power, American and British, that was to strike decisively in the death blow against the Nazi. Into Italy swept the Allies. There were stubborn battles among mountains, as typified by the bitter struggle for Cassino. Rome captured, a key event in the campaign that was eventually to liberate all of Italy. And at St. Peter's, Pope Pius gave papal blessing to a vast throng and a prayer for world peace. Tehran, the first conference of the Big Three, where Premier Stalin, President Roosevelt, and Prime Minister Churchill planned decisive blows against Nazi Germany. A preliminary of stupendous bombing. The Allies won control of the sky, and the air assaults were devastating. Air power struck incessantly at Hitler's war industry. The Nazi monster died hard and had to be smashed into submission. Germany under the bombs. The Russians hurled the German armies out of their country. Nazi hordes driven back to their lair as the Russians scored victory after victory in a series of campaigns that astonished the world. The Germans destroyed as they retreated. Russia ravaged unbelievably. The Russians, enduring a terrifying ordeal of war, saw it through and won out. General Eisenhower and Field Marshal Montgomery, as the decisive stroke from the west was planned. D-Day, the invasion of France. From the beaches of Normandy, the Allied armies swept on to Germany. The landings were the greatest hour of crisis of the global war. The Germans had boasted it could not be done. Their fortifications along the coast were impregnable, they said. But it was done, and the mighty thrust into the heart of Germany began on the beaches of Normandy. These landings sealed the doom of the Nazi. The liberation of France, like that of every other conquered country, presented scenes of wild ovation which had an eloquent meaning. The atrocities of Nazi brutality were reflected in the delirious joy of the liberated. Eisenhower in Paris, as the time of victory in the European war drew near. Yalta, the conference of the Big Three that planned the final destruction of Nazism. Soon afterward, with victory at hand, President Roosevelt died. Germany was collapsing in a cataclysm of destruction. The Nazis had begun the bombing of cities, and now German cities were perishing by bombing. The drive into the heart of Nazi Germany in the final hours of the European war. Hitler prolonged the war to live as long as he could and consigned his country to destruction. Closing in on Berlin, and the Russians capture the Nazi capital. The European war ends as the two guilty war makers meet their end. The last Hitler-Mussolini meeting, the execution of the fascist Duce by Italian patriots occurring soon afterward. Swift and summary justice, and then finally the world was rid of the evil creature whose megalomania took millions of lives and the depths of whose criminality was revealed in the atrocity disclosures shortly before he perished. The world thinks and prays. Everywhere in places of worship of every creed there is solemn observance. Victory rejoicing is tempered by the thought of those who gave their lives so that on this VE Day victory could be celebrated. Lest we forget them, and lest we forget that the global war is not over, that in the Pacific the armed might of the United Nations has that other power of barbarism to meet and crush. The Japanese must be hurled down to defeat. The forces of the Allies must converge on Tokyo from every direction. Fleets and armies must close in with all speed and power on the capital of the Japs. Directed war, VE Day must be followed by the annihilation of Japan.
Royal Road, majesty, dominion,